Reed, today we have Joe Summers on. Um, I feel like now it would be safe. I didn't know if the name of his new company set you off.
Synergy?
Yeah.
Not particularly.
Okay.
Just
I
because
just
it's a buzzword in itself, or
yeah. Because like years ago, like back when we were still at the Post, like you had this this one. There's a period in time where you were really set off by people at the Post using the word synergy,
you're right.
and you
Can't believe you remember that, but you're right. I went through at least 18 months of I had an allergy to that word.
yeah
Yeah.
yeah
And I think it started with a Weird Al Yankovic
yeah.
short
I was gonna bring
where
that up.
he was hitting all the buzzwords, and
Uh-huh.
it wasn't specific necessarily to marketing. And he had a couple in there pointed at synergy,
Yeah
and it just made me attuned to it.
yeah.
Like I couldn't stop seeing it or hearing it, and yeah, then I had a big problem with it. So let's thank you for bringing
Yeah.
that up,
Well,
Joe.
Joe.
Joe, I'm over it. I think
Yeah.
I am, but just hearing David bring that up, yeah, I don't know if you can keep the company names.
Just because I felt like we clicked so well with Joe, I could bring it
Yeah,
up like
yeah,
as the
yeah,
intro.
yeah, yeah.
But did you just an aside, another aside? But did you watch the Weird Al Yankovic movie?
I may have. I don't even know how it would have happened, but seen pieces of it.
It was amazing,
Was
like
it?
amazing. Yeah, I would. It would be one to.
Was it just one kind of like prolonged, kind of Weird Al Yankovic type skit, if you will, or was
Uh,
there actually a real
well, he
plot?
wasn't in it, so this was like his biopic,
Oh,
basically.
okay,
But it
okay.
was it was almost like a Weird Al Yankovic version of his biopic, if you will.
Sounds perfect.
It was very good. One that I would think you'd have to check the whole modern media thing or whatever you look at to see if it'd be okay to watch with your daughters. But I remember it kind of being
Common
like a
sense,
fun
yeah. Common
common
sense
sense.
media.
Yeah.
All right,
Well, Joe, anyways,
noted.
fun conversation with Joe.
Yeah, yeah. He's been in the industry, as he told us, since '99. So he's seen a few things and still has his hands in quite a few different companies. So I think he's got a great pulse for the industry. Certainly, as we enjoy very transparent, open book, and lots of contrarian kind of perspective there. But ultimately, he's trying to help move the industry forward, which is, very much lines up with our purpose. He's seems to be some sort of multifamily Sherpa now for like startups and tech companies to try and help them better understand the industry, get acquainted with it, and off to a faster start, so that we see more of that kind of integration come together in a good way versus some of the aches and pains that a lot of people
Hmm.
experience with it. So yeah, it was a fun conversation.
Yeah, we cover everything from like online advertising has changed since his first entry was in via, I think he said Apartment Guide, right, in DC.
Yeah, the Bible, as he called it, the
Yeah,
big
because it was
book,
so thick,
big book.
and all the way through like call tracking, attribution, even just like industry structure. We hit a bit on like branding the management company against like the property. I mean, it was just very wide ranging. So it was super fun to chat with, and I feel like we just ran out of time. Like I feel like I want to spend more time with the guy.
For sure. I think we just scratched the surface. So he would be good for we've never really done a panel on Digible Dudes, but
Hmm.
I would probably want him on there if we did, and just hit all sorts of like different topics. He'd be a fun contributor.
Yeah. Well, we hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Joe. Reed, we have Anthemos. I
I
actually
was
never.
I was wondering and slash hoping that you would say his full name.
Yeah, I actually didn't ever know. I only ever knew him as Anth. I didn't know like Anthemos was his full thing, although he did introduce himself as that.
I think I actually that was my first experience being of becoming aware of him was a press release, and I was like, man, I haven't read that first. Don't see that first name every day.
Yeah, you got jealous that you weren't the most unique CEO name.
Not even close. But then quickly found out that most people just call him Ant. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, super fun conversation. It's you and I have talked about this, never on the air, but we've talked about doing almost like an apartment history podcast, like about or like apartment marketing history podcast. And I feel like Anth would be an awesome one to tap into for that. Because we spent the first like third of the conversation talking about, the like where was the industry when Zumper first started
Hmm.
in 2012, and then versus where is it now versus where is it going. And it just made me excited to get more into that, and more people like him have more conversations like that, because there's so much stuff. It's kind of like you and I got swept into a river, right? Like a decade ago when we fell into apartments, and it was like it. And I think about this, it's like my snapshot was like, oh, this is how it's always been, not like it was this thing that was evolving and whatever, a living organism, as we've now come to understand it.
Yeah,
So just
totally.
interesting.
Well, I thought it was profound. Even I don't know when he said that they're the youngest ILS
Mm,
at 12 years. I mean, that kind of blew me away, and I mostly agree with them. I mean, as you said, it's like you hadn't really thought about it.
yeah.
Um, Dwellsy, I don't know when they came on and how much. I mean, we've heard, from Jonah directly that they have a huge amount of inventory. Um, but other than them, I'm just saying I don't know that there is another ILS that is younger than than Zumper, and that I think that I was trying to get to that. Is that a good thing? Both for I guess the industry as well as the consumer, or is that is that a problem? And I love the way that he addressed that. But what I also found was fascinating is just his acknowledgement that we're in a transition. Um, but nobody knows for how long. As far as like how people find apartments,
Hmm.
with the advent of generative AI and GPT, and I think it's awesome that even at their size and maturity, which he said we are, I think, past puberty, as I, but that they're definitely still very innovative. They're trying to make sure that they're leaning into the new technology and capitalizing where they can, but not fully knowing where it's headed. And so it's a really interesting time for the ILSs right now because I think everybody understands that we're in a transition. But where are we headed, and how long is this going to take? And then how much are you going to lead versus kind of be more in that the I guess the big middle as far as the adoption of some of this technology. But I think you have to take some bets and just be prepared. As they say, right? Have the appropriate courage to fail.
Well, we get into it towards the middle and end of the episode when he's talking about what they're experimenting with, and I think that's the right move. And he put it well. He's like, as one of those younger, or as the youngest of sort of the standard set of
Mm,
ILSs, they can experiment more than the other incumbents because you started to mention Innovator's Dilemma,
mhm.
right? And so they would have the least Innovator's Dilemma out of all of them. Although, as I was empathizing with him on the recording of, like, you just get there and you feel like you finally made it to the club. It's like you get into the Ivy Leagues or
And the
something.
sand moves underneath you again.
Yeah, and you're like, oh shoot, Ivy Leagues are different now. So as a founder, I was very interested about that, like how he thinks about that, and he seems very excited about it, which is what you want in a leader. But what's interesting is, like, if you're a co-star, what I've seen typically in other industries is you won't do the betting on it. You'll let everyone else waste their R&D dollars and take the brand risk. And if one of them seems to strike, then you come in and
Mhm.
you just buy them, right? And that's not unlike what Microsoft is doing with ChatGPT anyways, OpenAI, right? Like, Microsoft didn't try to build their model. They just waited till ChatGPT takes off and goes and invests 10 billion, and they're like, cool, now we got a piece, right?
Mhm.
So and he made a good point. He's like, Google's kind of the only one of these innovators that seems willing to kind of damage their own product, like as we talked about towards the end of the episode, like having the zero click search results, and now with like Gemini, where they decide to roll their own, and yada yada yada. So it's just really interesting because the safer playbook is to more sit back, wait, and then see if you can't get a stake in one of these folks.
Yeah, it is. I'll say, I guess, impressive. And you could say they have the money to do it, but that they're not clinging and not to take a shot at CoStar or Apartments.com, but to their legacy business model. Like they're prioritizing, it seems to me, the user experience versus the business model. Not many people have I guess, the latitude to do that, but that's a big bet on Google's part. But I am very curious what their business model will look like 10 years from now. Because I mean, it's hard to imagine that they won't still be raking in billions of dollars in search advertising. But on the other hand, if this does really start to pick up steam and it is, the experience, the Gemini experience, and far less advertisers are really getting ROI by paying for, like paid advertising on there, then how are they going to make money?
Yeah, it's interesting. We ran out of time, unfortunately, for to get to this, but I remember when we were first getting into the industry and I saw Apartment List. I was like, hey, this makes a ton of sense. It's like a match, profile or whatever. And that but it was a
Hmm.
guided
Hmm.
experience. And
Hmm.
then as you and I played with it, we learned kind of some of the limitations and how It was just leaving.
Frustrations,
Yeah,
yeah,
and frustrations.
for me.
But now it seems like it's poised for that same thing to be happening though, because like as I played with their meeting with Zumper's extension in GPT, and I didn't get into the detail that I'm about to, but I just said, hey, I was thinking about this. It's like, okay, well, we could work remote. So like, what might Nicole and I want in a working remote experience? It's like I want to be within a 3-hour flight of Denver. Something with the beach to live out the long winters from Denver. I'd like it to feel more authentic, blah, blah, blah. I gave all that stuff. And then it gave me some cities in Florida. And I said, okay, well, I'm surprised you didn't mention California. And then it said, how about California? I was like, and is there anything in Mexico? And then it gave me some places in Mexico. And I could actually go to search results on Zumper's site. It linked from Mexico. I was like, here's a couple locations in Mexico you might find really interesting. And then I was surprised they even had inventory, honestly, in Mexico. And so then if you think about that, like if I had spent any more time with it, more than like 3 minutes, giving my little whatever like uh, paragraph at it, what it could do to actually match me to the unit that I was interested in. Like it could show me some results and ask me like for that feedback loop of like, why don't you like this? Why do you like that? And then maybe I go down a rabbit hole of like Cabo San Lucas or something. And it's like, oh, now because you answered all these questions, might you want to consider just outside San Diego one more time, so that I'm not stuck drilled into this one area and it seems limiting. So it just, to me, then it could become like that national locator we have talked about. And that seems like I mean, people are willing to pay a good dollar for that. So it just was interesting.
Super interesting. And that's what I was getting at to some degree, like with Meet Elise or Elise, sorry, Elise AI is, they poise to bring something like this to market, since they, he said the toughest thing is when you're building supplier side is the relationships and the piping. So if they already have relationships and piping and they already have the technology, don't they just point that now directly, to the renter on the front end of the search instead of waiting for them to get to the website? And they have that, virtual agent, and it's coming in more of an agnostic, I guess, version or form, which is what I think is critical. But um, gosh, where was I going to go about? So our good friend Melissa Robbins, we haven't chatted with her in a little while, but I saw her do a presentation 4 or 5 years ago, I think now, at the Colorado Apartment Association, talking about what marketing would look like in this industry like 10 years from now. And I love that stuff. And she speculated or forecasted, and this was very much predated. I'm not saying it wasn't a formation, but OpenAI and GPT. And she just surmised that technology would be so sophisticated that instead of most marketers talking about trying to generate a couple hundred leads a month, qualified leads, they'd be talking about 20 to 25. And that instead of a conversion rate of whatever, fill it in 3 to 5%, depending on, lease to tour versus lead to lease, but that you'd be talking now about 80, 90%, because it would be so accurate. And what you just described, if you had just spent a few more minutes on it, may have in fact
Mm-hmm.
created this perfect match at even a unit level.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that were to happen, which I very much believe will happen, back to the transition, but when, because a lot of other things and people have to, play nice, we'll say, in to some degree, then what's the business model? I was going to tell him when you asked him that question, I don't know how you avoid a performance based business model. But then back to the piping is, how do you, if GPT and it's happening offsite, not on my website, then how does the attribution work
Mm-hmm.
so that I know, that was sourced? Because at this point, without, third party tracking and links and all the rest, you might have just gone through 90% of your research on GPT, right? They should get credit,
Mm-hmm.
but will they? And so don't they, for suppliers, if he's saying that's really going to be our role is the inventory, then those two have to figure that out in order to maintain a viable business model, really on both sides, but more so obviously because GPT is just going to be raking in on subscriptions, because they serve so many purposes, not just vertically. But for those suppliers, they have to figure out how they're going to move to a performance model that has secure, I guess, attribution.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, right now, it just my experience was it was linking me to the Zumper listing, and then from the Zumper listing, it would go through the normal channel, so Zumper gets credit there, but to your point, there's almost even more of a chance that someone would go around the portal at that point, just go to the property or call the property. And that's what he says is coming with them, right? Is that it will actually start doing for you. So now if it will like book it for you, or
Right.
if your agent knows your personal info and will fill out the application for you, then it's
Then you
far
close the
easier.
gap. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
As it stands, though, it's a gap because I also went around, had a lot of fun on it, but I was really frustrated that there weren't pictures, video, and I've already been on GPT. I'm just saying, like, hey, is Rhino a good? I mean, I didn't get as deep as you did, but just is Rhino a good neighborhood to live in Denver?
Hmm.
Got great information back, but then I found myself saying, okay, now I got to go to Google
Hmm.
and search. So back to multi browsers, which he's painting a picture of a single browser, which
Yeah.
I also think is probably pretty realistic. It's just a matter of when. But for now, it almost felt like more cumbersome. Not
Mm.
like in isolation, amazing. That's what I was trying to express. But it's like you've actually added a step or some more complexity for me in trying to find an apartment, which is why I was teeing it up in a way with consolidation. It's like and it's trade-offs, right? There's disadvantages of losing some of that optionality, but there's also a lot of benefits to it. And that's what I'm curious to see how that works out with generative AI and with GPT.
Yeah, I remember what it was like when I was back in New York and I was trying to figure out if I was going to move to like Portland, Seattle, Denver, the Carolinas. And this experience is so much better to like at least hone in. Now, beyond that, I did feel the pull to start looking at other listings because typically now this is part user error though, right? Like I'm not a prompt engineer. So
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of other people that would probably tell it to like now rank me a list of 50 assets I should look at or something. Instead, I was just like, give me some,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives you
Mm-hmm.
three, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, shoot, well, what am I missing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if I was a better prompter, I would probably get better results. But until that, it's like you and I both know how to use Google really well and multi-browse, so
Mm-hmm.
like very quickly you default to your strength versus continuing to try to hammer through. Um, so yeah, I just over time I think I'll become better at it, but I also think these models will become better at even helping prompt me or helping guide me through to get a better experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it's exciting. It's super exciting.
It is, and I enjoyed our kind of exchange. I'll say in the first 5 to 10 minutes about is it harder or easier right now to come in and compete? Because I stand by, but I appreciate his points. They're very
Wait,
valid
why did you? I didn't pick up on why you thought it was easier to compete now.
because I feel like a big part of being a competing in this space is content.
Oh, I see.
And I feel like because of GPT, and it's not just ChatGPT, but that developing, scaling, distributing content is easier than it's ever been. And that's a huge impediment, or at least it would have been, where it's like, um, but I don't think in terms when I say content of just the kind of property assets. And that's what I would probably be thinking about or trying to leverage is you mentioned all this kind of front end, before you get to the property. I mean, we've talked about it a million times, right? That's the real experience. It's not going straight to, an ILS or straight to a property site. There's so much that's happening up front. That's where I think the opportunity is for a competitor is to like lean into that and try to kind of intercept as much of that traffic as you can before you're now competing with, these incumbents. And then the other part that I was saying, as far as the ease, I guess, to get in is that there isn't much equity. So if you go back in time to the apartment guide and the gas station and stuff, I mean, I feel like there was, and the newspapers, the classifieds, there was some equity where it's like, these are the names, these is where I'm going to go, to Craigslist, whatever. But then with the proliferation of ILSs and with search, I mean, and with Google, I think a lot of that was lost. And so I don't feel like, oh, I'm dealing with all these super loyal big brands other than apartments.com. And that's why I was also asking at the end, like, why aren't more people doing that? Because it does seem like if there's anybody that's built up some brand loyalty with consumers, it's them. And it's because they've spent a truckload of money on that. But other than them, what's preventing me, if I have some good capital, raise some money, from pouring a bunch of money into search, and some of these other channels that he was saying that may be a little bit more grassroots. And I'm toe to toe with you. So I still agree, and it makes, I mean, it's just super strong points about the real moat is building the supply side. Um, but other than that, I think it's easier to come into the market right now, as a new ILS, not harder.
You think to generate the demand side basically because of the content.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but you're probably more feeling that because you haven't seen any of these ILSs leverage that to the extent you would
True,
want to.
100%.
Right. Because
Yeah,
otherwise, like in theory, it's kind of like bankrate.com or whatever these websites that help recommend credit cards. Like very hard to compete on that now because all of those folks are leveraging, that. Whereas we haven't yet seen that from the ILSs. I mean, they have pockets of it, but it's not to the same extent you see for Bankrate.
totally. The other part of that that I didn't get to then, and I'm going to get to now since you asked, but it isn't a transition period like that's driven by, I mean, of course, the technology that's being created in this case, but the consumer, meaning in the way that they're finding apartments. Isn't that the perfect time? Isn't that going to be the easiest time to come in and compete versus on the front end or on the back, meaning on the front end where it's super crowded, and it is that arms race, or on the tail end when they, now it's the dust is settled and these are the incumbents. Like if you're thinking about, yeah, the easiest time to come into an industry, isn't it during a transition?
I mean, I think in some ways that's kind of what Anth was saying. He was saying that
Because
the
you're not
startups have
wed
less
to
to
the,
lose.
yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. So in some ways, but in other ways, it depends, right? It's kind of like we were talking about 90, the software we used to run our meetings this morning, and how Aaron was like, they finally added a search,
mm-hmm,
like a type search for Teams, and for the longest time, they were like, that's kind of like this, like it's a feature that feels like a must-have, but doesn't really move the thing forward, and so they didn't add being able to search by team until now. And in some ways, if you're a startup, I think that's what you would suffer here, where you're like, well, shoot, I got to build all these MITS feeds and XML file, whatever, and it feels like it's not additive. And so there's a lot of just infrastructure crap you got to do before you can even, now I'm going to put my little spin on it.
mm-hmm,
And so maybe that would work out if you were that startup and he mentioned that they bought PadMapper. If you could find a PadMapper to acquire that had like really spent the effort to do all the basic
mm-hmm,
crap first, and then
mm-hmm.
you could try to put your spin on it. But there's a certain amount of just like effort, it seems, that now has to go into it before you can even try to take the little, your little innovative spin on it.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, think about that for ourselves, though. I mean, that's where I knew you were speaking from, I guess, personal experience and the truth is, all the work we did on NLG, and then we've essentially kind of just shut that down because
Yeah.
it's like, well, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Why are we going to burn more calories there, put more resources there? And that was frustrating, and even more so maybe for me because I was,
Yeah.
participating in some of that. And then it's like, well, now if somebody wants to come in and provide, generative, content or using generative AI, so easy, right? There's no barrier at all,
Yeah.
versus like all the hours, because that's what we were thinking. I remember
Yeah. We
that.
spent thousands of
Yeah.
hours over
It
the
was
years.
like,
Yeah.
man, this is going to put so much distance between us and our
And it
competition.
it
And then
did, but
snap of a finger, it's
yeah,
gone.
that's what's interesting, right? It did, and it was really wowing for people. But then once there is an off the shelf thing, it's almost like everyone forgets about that. And
Yeah.
now they're just on the off the shelf thing. And now they think like, oh, you're just using the off the shelf thing. And now you have to try to differentiate yourself. Kind of like even when we talked to Robert from BetterBot, like how do you do it differently now versus those that are just picking up the tool?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of crap that we learned for those 4 years that we put into the R&D before the language models off the shelf came, right? That we're leveraging now,
Mhm.
that a Robert is leveraging versus the startup that comes in and thinks they can just
Mhm.
plug into OpenAI or whatever.
Well, last thing, if I can, on this is I won't say if I'm Anth, but like if you are leading ILS, which obviously he is, it does remind me of when we were at the Post, and I'll just say in media in general, like with traditional versus digital, people were terrified of that digital train coming, and it was like, but eventually everybody said we got to get on it. It's the only way we will survive. Is that the way these ILSs are seeing generative AI? It's like here comes this train, and we've got to get on it.
Mhm.
We got to figure out how to do it. And what I learned through that experience was that we shouldn't have been thinking one or the other, or that we just got to get on this digital train, and that will kind of bridge this gap in our business. It really would have been smarter to form a third or a different, kind of profit center. And that could be really bold, and you might need to get really radical with that. Truly think outside the box. But I just am seeing, I guess, some similarities there, where it's like it's not one or the other, and you figured out how to make money on AI. Like, if you really want to survive and perhaps thrive, you might need to be thinking about an entirely, and I don't want to say different business per se, but a different way to make money within kind of the foundation that you have. And that just takes some really outside of the box thinking.
This is already one of our longest intros, but now I have to understand better. What do you mean by back in the past you would have said go after a different profit center?
So my best example was the Washington Post, and I don't know if I believe this was post Bezos, but where they within a couple of years, and this is what I heard from our CEO at the time, were making over $1 million a year in wine sales.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds crazy. Probably for our listeners, they may have already dropped off or don't know what the hell I'm trying to, what I'm talking about. But what I have told you a few times, and I'll share with those that are listening, is I looked at the Post and I said, we have so many advantages that other startups don't. We have this incredible brand equity. We have these business relationships. We have consumer relationships. We have the data. We have the marketing megaphone, so to speak. So, we had some huge advantages in how quickly we could go to market and advertise. And we weren't really leveraging that for anything else other than how do we figure out digital or keep selling what we can of print. And I think when you have gotten to 12 years old or have reached a certain maturity level as a business, a lot of people overlook, the kind of that foundation for innovation that you have. Like, you can create other profit centers or businesses if you can zoom out, of like the huge, I guess, kind of transition or disruption. And you might be surprised with how where else you can make money. And so I'm not encouraging Ant to try and, create an online like e-commerce, like wine store or something. But I love that example. And it didn't save the Post. I mean, the Post is doing fine, meaning the Washington Post. But I thought, man, that where did that come from? And why don't we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And aren't there 10 more examples just like that, those wine sales that we could do and take some pressure off of ourselves, and also probably improve culture, versus like we're either going to feast or famine on digital.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of that right now going on with the ILSs as they're seeing this AI train coming down.
So I have one last thing. He mentioned the move to mobile, right? And it just struck me because obviously you and I spent a lot of time when it was like mobile first to this or whatever. Do you think that this is a bigger shift than the move to mobile or not? And on how fast of a time horizon?
Well, that's what's hard to answer, because the shift to what? Meaning like the AI disruption, or the shift specifically like with generative AI? Is generative AI, are you making that comparison to mobile?
Yeah, yeah. He's saying Web 3.0,
Okay.
and he's
Okay.
saying forget blockchain crypto. He's saying more of like in the past it was you could, interact with a website basically, and now you can maybe interact and do something with a website. That's how he was. I'm really dumbing down what Anth said about Web 3. But when he talked about Web 3, I just thought it was interesting because I remember well, I won't give my answer yet. So, anyways, the move to mobile versus the move to this Web 3 world where he says you're engaging with an AI on the web.
Yeah, that is extremely difficult to answer. And part of my nature is to give you like the answer I don't think you're expecting, which would say mobile is actually the bigger change, and mainly because of the accessibility that that created. So a different type accessibility than generative AI, right? Where it's like now there's so much more content that I can get connected to with generative AI, but being able to get content to somebody anywhere, anytime is hard to I say that this is more impactful than that.
Yeah.
And we see it every day now. We're reminded of that, of just how powerful the mobile transformation was. So I'm going to stick with mobile, but I think I could just as easily make the argument
Yeah, I mean, it's
for
like when we
generative.
look at apartment searches, it's over 60% of website traffic's from mobile. So
At least, right?
right, so in
So
that
I'm
way,
surprised it's only
and
yeah.
when we were talking with Anth on the recording, we said, it would probably he asked about 24 months, and then we kinda talked about 5, 6 years or something, and we're like, "Yeah, it's gonna be slow." Right? And if you think about mobile and, like, from the first iPhone until, like, where it felt like everyone had a smartphone, those contract cycles on cell phones are, like, 1 to 2 years. So it was really within 2 years that it felt like everyone I knew had a smartphone, which
Mhm,
was then meant everyone was doing
mhm,
something all my
mhm,
friends were doing something on mobile, and I don't see the shift to like 60% of my searches going through generative AI happening in the same sort of speed in the next 24 months. But here's the thing. What
or
was
will it?
well, that's the point,
But I
right?
think you're probably right, but then
But what
again
was interesting is even last year, I was at a conference and they were talking about as one of the like big sessions, man, we got to make sure our websites are mobile optimized, right? So like even with that big a switch, it's been over it. Well, it's been like 15 years or something,
mhm,
and not all websites are good on mobile yet, right?
mhm, mhm,
And so, and I think the difference is like when you talked about mobile websites, it required every individual website owner to go and figure that out and build their own UI and get you good. Now the agents are basically doing a lot of that for you. And so you don't have to make it good for it to go find you. Now, sure, it's going to help. It's kind of like voice search or whatever. It's like you can do some optimization to make it better.
mhm,
But for the most part, I feel like the agents are good enough that you don't have the same
mhm.
headwind, I guess, of like, now I got to get a SMB plumber to like figure out how to make a mobile website. Um,
True.
so I think in some ways that'll be faster, but it'll feel more seamless, I guess, than the mobile switch.
You know what I don't know? I guess it wouldn't I shouldn't expect, maybe it's just it was net neutral, but just think about the not just access of information, anytime, anywhere that evolution created, but also he kept talking about the doing or the action. And you know, if I'm on my laptop searching pre-mobile evolution, I can't, it's not one click away where I can just call that, property and say, hey, do you have this unit, etc. Same thing. More so, I'm thinking about Amazon, and maybe that's not the right comparison, but I'm just wondering from a retail standpoint how much mobile changed the economics, or if it was, there wasn't any, like, when you think, I don't know if GDP is the right place to go with this, but like that, it didn't change. It was in fact just where it was happening.
You
Do you
know,
follow me?
I am. It's funny because I can't remember who to attribute this
Super
to.
macro,
I remember I can't remember who to give this to, but there was a point in time where stores were concerned because you were going in store and then buying on Amazon or buying like doing price searching while you're in Target or something. And there was some talk about like how do you limit internet access when you're inside of a store so someone can't just like cannibalize like your the shelf price that you're getting. And obviously that didn't end up going anywhere,
yeah.
and for good reason. But I also have seen the reverse. I'm trying to remember what search engine it was, but there was a search engine for a time that really focused on local consumer, and meaning like I want to buy headphones now. I don't want to wait for Amazon for 2 days or
Hmm.
whatever. And so then
Hmm.
it would tell you what store to go get that model in. Google's done a decent job of that now, but it's not as good as what I forget what the search engine I was using because it went kaput. But um, yeah, I mean, I would bet that like GDP to your point went up. Like if you looked at it from total US sales because of the smartphone,
Right.
but I don't think but as far as like local, I mean, we always heard about Main Street getting, beat out
Hmm.
for local shoppers and stuff. So,
Then the question is, with generative AI, will it impact GDP? And maybe we should point it back at our industry, but do you see a winner or a loser here? I'll say between classes, like our class A properties, for example, going to benefit more from generative AI than Class B. These are fun things that we could pick back up, like, with another segment. But, as you think about that super pointed, I don't know, I was going to say search, but that experience that you were describing when you were just kind of playing around with the widget. Um, and maybe again, I'm acknowledging maybe there's no impact, but it just seems like with transformative technology, big evolutions in the way that people, that it's hard for me to imagine that that doesn't have an impact on that level. And how do you normalize it would be the question,
Well,
with all the other variables.
I do love this topic. I can't stop myself. But okay, on one hand, it's kind of like if you had 7 Googles competing, is there more ad spend happening on 7 different search engines? Or is it better because there's one search engine now where everyone's competing against each other?
Totally.
And then when you get to the
Consolidation versus proliferation.
yeah, I don't know. And then once you get down to the agent level, then it could be how does the agent work? Because the agent I was working with today could have been upselling me. It
Mhm.
could have said, "Hey, I know you said you wanted to stay at $2,500 a month, but really you should get this other thing because it's 2750 and it's closer to walking trails."
Totally.
It could totally upsell me and help with that GDP, but it would in this case it would work because of the consolidation. But then back to the business model where you're trying to get to with Anth, like does it? Because I'm wondering if you don't have to spend on 6 different ILSs, if that becomes a good thing. It's kind of like the one to Google or
Right.
not. And
Right.
then can those dollars go elsewhere? Or does it just mean that you spend more on the one source because it's, as you were saying, it's the Melissa Robbins 90% quality?
Mhm. Your upsell is so interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of concern, and right now it still is mostly aimed at TikTok, but just about sentiment, right? And like, but there's been tons of articles with generative AI is like that's one of the dangers is like as it starts to infiltrate and we all start getting really comfortable with it, that just the smallest, kind of I guess I don't want to say changes, but influence on sentiment could have huge implications, in the way that Google, right? I'll stay with Google, but I was just kind of heard this from about TikTok. But where I'm going is that if generative AI gets adopted, as we're assuming it will, like in masses, then that upsell you just described, won't that be happening? That there'll be a lot more, I'll say, exposure to upselling and sales, some version of sales through these tools. And therefore, why wouldn't we expect that more people are going to be buying Class A
Well, it depends because
properties?
it could go the other way, right? Like it's almost like I'm imagining a model, like you haven't talked about this on the air yet, but your fixed, flexible, and free model.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you need your agent to know what is fixed, flexible, and free. Hey, that is fixed. You cannot go outside this budget range, or it's flexible, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like give me some other options, right? Like that's what I'll need with the model eventually, because I've witnessed with the model where I'm giving it like a page of notes basically of like this is what I'm trying to find, and it will work pretty well, but eventually it starts forgetting about some of the first points I made when I'm
Mm-hmm.
like 6 questions deep,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, hey, don't forget I said that this one thing up top. So but I don't currently have a way to tell the model this is fixed, you cannot go outside of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could keep going.
Yeah. All
We
right.
better stop.
Well, you now are the winner for the longest intro because you left us thinking.
What a great trivia question for us, for Digible Dudes. What is the longest intro? This has to be right there. So
Yeah.
apologies, but it also tells you that we love the conversation, and hopefully everybody else will too.
Yeah, our producer's gonna have a heyday with this because they just sent us a note last week saying,
Cut it down.
no, they said short intros perform better. People listen.
Oh,
I was like, great. Next recording.
We should do an A/B test.
Yeah.
They should edit this down to a 60-second intro,
Okay.
and then let the marathon,
Yeah.
and let's see which one does
Let the
better.
public decide.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you guys will really enjoy this conversation with Anth. I know we did. So, Reed, today's episode is brought to you by Price Fixer. You'll remember they fix the prices and the blame. You love them, I know already, because it's a software that raises the rents, but also gives you someone to blame for it. That's Price Fixer, plausible deniability. You're a big fan, right?
You should write you should write commercials for this industry. That was spot on.
But now
Huge fan.
introducing Price Fixer Pro.
As an owner, I'm a huge fan.
Okay. Price Fixer Pro raises the rents one story at a time. For those looking to up their game, and Price Fixer Pro now not only raises the rents, but crafts the perfect story to justify the price hike.
That's amazing.
From a plausible mandatory pigeon relocation to a global parking crisis, Price Fixer Pro generates the perfect, slightly ridiculous, yet plausible reason for each price hike. Don't just set the prices. We don't just set the prices. We make up the story. And Reed,
do you have a jingle yet?
I don't, but I missed their tagline, which is because a good story can sell anything.
Damn straight. Wow. And what do I have to do in order to sign up?
Oh, it's like 17 easy payments of like $13.49.
Okay. I thought you were going to say, just give me your data.
Yeah. Right. It's funny because so today.
Well done, man. Well done.
Thank you. I was the hard part is I was working on our ad reads. I mean, of course we take a hefty commission from any referrals, but I had too many options, a cornucopia of advertisers that wanted to get in on the Digible Dudes. But yeah, we have Dom on today. Dom Beveridge has come back and talked about the RealPage intro. Well, he did work in his sponsor Radix at the end, and I was like, "Son of a gun, man! Yeah. We got to make sure our sponsors get out in front." So,
yep.
I hope Price Fixer doesn't compete with Radix.
That could be.
I don't think.
Yeah, they could be in trouble if they do. The hell of an ad campaign.
Okay, so Dom, he's second time on this year, and he's been interviewing the I guess like just a various experts on the RealPage. I keep saying lawsuit, but there's multiple lawsuits as he reminds us. Some
multiple class actions, right?
Oh,
or had it been consolidated. I don't remember whether he made that. Yeah, we're back into the courtroom talk that you hate so much.
Yeah, I was thinking of this when Dom was on. He wouldn't have got it, but I was like, former and latter, and then overruled and plaintiff. If you were to throw all those at me, I would just short circuit. I'd be like, I don't know what we are talking about.
Yeah. David's Achilles heel. We finally found it.
Yeah. So, anyways,
courtroom legalese.
What do you enjoy out of this conversation?
Maybe. Not to be flatter Dom here, but maybe what didn't I enjoy? I think it's such an interesting topic, and it feels like it's pretty polarizing in a way. As far as how people feel about it, including Dom. And I don't mean this as like necessarily that he has a bias. I think he's super well informed, better than most, but very convicted about kind of his position on this. And I don't know that we're going to be able to find that person, meaning the plaintiff, to get their perspective on it. But I'm tempted, where it's like whenever you have a subject like this that's such a lightning rod, within the industry, nothing would be better than to hear kind of counterpoint or perspective. But I'm not going to hold out hopes for that. And I don't mean to, because Dom certainly is not like, on RealPage's payroll or saying that everything's all and well. Like, in fact, he offered, I think, a lot of valuable kind of what would be the right way of putting it, just concerns or opportunities. But we didn't spend most of the time there. It was more on this actual these lawsuits and how much we should care about it.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Although he did, with his experience, he basically was pretty clear up front that he didn't think that these lawsuits were, had merit, and they've been more strategically.
He didn't use the word fruitless, but that's another in the legal lexicon. No, frivolous.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
I was like, I feel like I can go with fruitless.
It would have been great if you were like, yeah, fruitless.
If you asked me to spell frivolous, that would be an issue.
But yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. He seemed pretty clear on his conclusion, which is like,
which is interesting because
throughout the shakedown almost.
Yeah, but I also see, like, as he was getting deeper into it, how I don't know, the layman could just jump to the conclusion of, hey, this is a problem, right? So like, these pricing algorithms are aggregating all of this data, and whether it's known or unknown, you asked him eventually about disparate impact. then isn't the point of these to be able to generate more revenue? And he makes the point that the word that generate revenue and price seem to be like interchanged, in a lot of these cases. And he's saying like if you
But
just
shouldn't be. Yeah.
yeah, right. So if you just lease something for 4 more days, you get 4 more days of revenue, therefore more revenue for the building. However, I do wonder how that shakes out. Like, because it would not be good, right, for RealPage if their defense, because I don't know what their defense is going to be, but if their defense was like, no, we don't help you, like rent never goes up when you use our tool, then from a marketing angle, you're like, so I
Good
don't,
luck selling that.
yeah, it doesn't help me raise rent. Confusing. And if they just then tried to stick on the like less vacant days, which is kind of was one of Dom's stronger arguments, is that it's really more to help you have fewer sell through or fewer vacancies.
But what I pointed out, I guess, is how's that translate to the resident sentiment, we'll say right now around rent, and the affordability of multifamily, units, which I don't think is great. I think you talk to most residents. I mean, we could do a poll here in Digible. We have so many that live in multifamily, and they'd say, "Yeah, I got screwed. It was a 20% hike, 30%, 15%." And I know some of that is being in the Denver market and kind of. I mean, it should be supply and demand. You like to think, not to dive right back into it, but it doesn't line up with the 4%, which is like that's
right.
All this really does is like, or when I say all it does, it's meaningful in a compounded way. But if you were to not use rev management, he was saying you might see 4 points less, which is a big deal and sometimes can be the difference, right, between an owner having a successful outcome and not, or
Yeah.
even buying into a community or a new build.
You do want, like, I would obviously I would not like this hanging over me like RealPage does, meaning if you did go all the way to trial, which my understanding is most of these things end up settling outside of the trial, because I think he pointed out, or you did, but it could be a very confusing lawsuit to the jury.
Oh yeah.
With things that they like have little interest in, and yet very quickly might latch on to, like, any of these examples of like, oh, prices in Denver went up 27% or whatever over a year or something. And it's one of those things where
I think it'd be easy to get juries on board
right.
with, yeah.
Yeah, just from a sentiment. And
Yeah.
even it's also strange because it's like he sort of made the point that correlation's not causation. He didn't quite go there, but it is true. It's like you and I have talked about this so many times in our own case studies. Is like, just because because we generated more leads, does that not mean it was us that generated the more leads, right?
That's right.
Or optimizations. It could have been something market driven. But again, that doesn't bode well for, I guess, like RealPage if they go that far, and even if they win it, depending like what comes out in the lawsuit.
I'd be scared to death if I were them of it going to trial.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. And I don't know that we'll find out what that settlement looks like or collection of settlements, but I would imagine it's gonna be pretty significant. And then where do we go from there? Because isn't that just incentivize more lawsuits? Versus like, well, we took care of that. And you're seeing that in all sorts of different areas. I'll say a big tech, that it seems like the snowball effect, as far as legislation, and whether it's coming from federal or whether it's these private lawsuits. That's what I'm curious to see is, how does this unfold over the next few years? And I was also mentioning, is this in some backwards way good for those that are in revenue management? Because who in their right mind, seeing what's going on in the climate, would say, that's what I think I'm going to do for a new startup, or I'm going to start up a company on rev management. So more power to you, the ones that are fighting the fight right now, including Reverb, which has certainly got, as he was saying, some traction, a little bit more of a unique value prop, it sounds to me, as far as incorporating more of the marketing component and the concessions, things like that. The question I didn't get to ask him, but I was starting to get there, we just ran out of time, was I did ask, and you were going to as well, what if rev management didn't exist? What do we think the rent roll would look like? But to your point, as far as I'll call it efficacy of the software itself, it's hard not to imagine that this hasn't had a pretty significant impact on rent rates. That if you were to look back, timestamp it from 10, 15 years ago, that this absolutely has driven rents up probably more than they should be.
Mm-hmm.
And how I, I mean, it's not necessarily opposed to Dom, but how does the industry feel about that? You
Mm-hmm.
know, and does it seem anti-capitalist to say that's not okay? You know, it's like, well, the airlines do it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
hotels do it, automotive does it, you know. So where do you draw the line? And we started to also touch a little bit on that whole monopoly versus anti-competitive, but the reality is yeah, I do think that's my sense is that this software has definitely driven up and compounded or created an even bigger problem for affordable housing, for the housing crisis. That's my belief.
Well, and I mean, I don't have
But
enough.
does that mean that it's illegal?
Right, right. Yeah, that's the free market kind of thing.
Exactly.
Because you could just rent a different building if that's the case, and you definitely don't have you don't have it 90% of folks on RealPage's software to do this, right? Meaning of the market, they don't have that much market share. So I do wonder if there's anything. If you think back to like when this first came out, he was saying the Sherman Act is where a lot of these folks are what the lawsuits are.
1930.
Yeah, exactly. So 100 years ago, there wasn't the same just information accessibility both to the public and to the companies that back 100 years ago. And so does it need to be a perfect across the US kind of thing in order for it to not, I guess, pass the Sherman Act? Or if it, as some of the lawsuits in the ProPublica piece also called out, if it was just a certain zip code or a certain class of building or whatever type of product that's actually influenced up, is that enough to be a problem? And that's where Dom sort of hinted at it, like maybe we need to rework some of these rules, because I don't know what the right answer would be. I mean, I definitely have been more of a free market person in the past, um, but yeah, I mean, I could definitely see an unintended, like, even if like probably wasn't intended to do what they're being accused of, if it has an unintended impact there, then that could be an issue.
Yep. And I'm wondering if it will spark, that was towards the end of the cast, but just any kind of all the consumer data advocacy, you know, groups and efforts right now. Could this turn into a scenario where there is the optionality for a renter to say, you can't share my data, my lease agreement, or anything
Hmm.
else? Why not? You know, but maybe it'll be a small percentage that, you know, I don't want to say carry that flag, but experiment with that and see how that goes. But that would be fascinating.
Hmm.
Similar to, as I said, you know, the optionality of sharing your data online.
Hmm. Well, really informative episode for myself, at least talking to Dom here. And he's got I think it's a 6-part series that's coming out on his feed, 20 for 20. He mentions how to get to it, and we'll link to it in the show notes, but also on your podcast player. I just made sure to do 20 for 20, but then also include Dom, because mine was coming up with some other 20 for 20s as well. So anyways, hope you guys enjoy. Reed, we have Maddie on from GoldOller today. She made me feel a little bit sad because we didn't see her booth at NAA. Like, we're one of the few people that must have missed it.
I'd feel worse if NAA was one football field instead of like 17.
Yeah,
I forget exactly
she
how
did say
big it
she was
is.
in the like one of the last booths
Yeah,
because
she was in a corner spot, which often could be a great spot, and it sounds like they got a lot of traffic, but it is so cavernous. And I forget who it was. It was somebody else that we know that was telling me that they felt like it was smaller actually in Philadelphia
Mm.
than in years past. And then I just said, "Could you just look that way?" Like at the far end
There were
and
times I actually felt that when I was
oh,
first
really?
walking it. I was
Okay.
like, this doesn't seem and
Maybe it was. Maybe it was.
and
Versus Atlanta or San Diego or
well, also I'm not sure how. Now I've been to a number of these, so
yeah.
now it's like I remember the very first time Nicole and I walked in. It was like when they were still setting up the first year
Mhm.
where we didn't even have passes. And I was like, "What the heck is this?" Because nobody had. I never met someone that had warned me about how big. They're just like, "Oh, you got to go to NAA." It's like, okay, and then I was like shocked, but because I didn't expect cranes or
Mhm.
whatever
Mhm.
setting everything up. So now I wonder if some of that is wearing off on me. Where I'm like, "Yeah, I've seen this before. We cranes, shipping containers, whatever."
Desensitized is a real thing, and it may be that both of us, because I still marvel at the magnitude of NAA and I guess the industry, and that's usually the best example of that, like where you really feel just how many people are in it. but it isn't the same as the first time or the first couple of years that you walk in. It's more like seeing Disney World for the first time or visiting another planet. Like that was
Yeah.
my experience the first couple times.
You know what I don't get desensitized to? When someone walks out of the men's room and doesn't wash their hands. I still am like, what is wrong with you, dude? And so much so that we
I
were
never saw that one coming.
we were at Target
But you know how I feel about it.
this last week, and there's this young kid who was faster than me, coming in and out, and he did like the whole happy birthday song washing his hands, and I was like, I want to find his parents and tell them like how
Nice
amazing
job.
this
Gold
child is.
star.
Because like I've never seen a child that like does the whole like double soap. Like I was like, geez, what is? And he must have been like 7 or 8 years old. It's like this is incredible.
I'm putting it on my calendar. When Griffin turns 7, I'm going to find a way to join him at
I,
a urinal.
yeah,
See if he's,
I was thinking about this. It's
if
like,
that is
how did they
followed
get
up on
him?
his.
I mean, right now he loves to wash his hands, but only because he loves to play in the water.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
not.
for a different reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we need to get some of the adults though that are coming out of this Target bathroom to also like to play in the water. 'Cause they just skip on by.
Maybe that'd be a better strategy.
Yeah.
This is just talking about general hygiene and sanitation.
Yeah. Make it more.
Have fun with
game.
it. Yeah. Well, that was a bit of a detour or right turn.
It's just what hit me. It was
intro.
So it had marked me so hard.
But yeah, I wish that we had seen it. She said she would show some photos. Maddie did, because it sounded killer, and it blew both of us away. Maybe me more than you. That this hasn't happened before. So to her knowledge, I'll just give her a little bit of a qualifier caveat there. This is a first for NAA to have a PMC actually sponsor a booth. And just seems bizarre. I mean, you have the entire industry there, and I know for a fact we've seen, for example, RKW sponsor Optech and like title sponsor.
I wonder, did
I
they
didn't
have
know if
booths,
that's what
though?
I was gonna say. I didn't
Yeah.
know if they had a booth, but I feel like I've definitely seen that before. But maybe an actual physical booth. This is a first, and I'm glad they had success with it. I think it'd be cool to see more of them out there, so that they could start building their brands. That's one of the things, it's so difficult for these PMCs, right? Is in this industry, it's like you just have to concede that that's unattainable to a degree. It's like, are we going to get people thinking Bonvoy, Marriott, that whole thing with GoldOller, and perhaps locally, we've said that if you're really saturated in one market, maybe it's there for the taking, but obviously that's not how you'd approach it.
I think it also
going to NAA
depends on your goal, right? Because like RKW was going, they were going wide. That's one reason they were doing it. And GoldOller still seems like not quite nationwide. We didn't ask that specifically, but it sounds like more regional. I could be wrong on that,
but I thought RKW, while they were willing to take properties, further west, they were still concentrating on,
they were concentrated, but they did do a lot of the national conferences. So that's why I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, but because we've seen Willowbridge do a couple, Graystar do a couple, but they're not hitting it hard. Like to her point on the podcast, like Entrada, where you have a third party manager coming in. It's just super interesting. I also loved her when we asked, like, we'd have been told before that maybe it's not super profitable to be third party. So what's the point? And it just makes it easy. It's deal flow is kind of where her answer landed for me, how I interpreted it, which makes a ton of sense. It's like, great. Now you can manage the property. You could maybe get a piece of the property. And if that's where the real money is made, then yeah, it's good for you.
I wanted to ask you about that. And you also now have me wanting to ask some others, like meaning owners in our network, about that statement, I guess, that there's not a lot of money to be made in third party management, because we both definitely know it's single digits typically, as far as what kind of profits you might expect as a third party management. I don't know what the spectrum is right now. I mean, what's the range? Is it 3 to 10%? And if you're in double digits, you're crushing it, or is there kind of an invisible ceiling? It's like you can't get past 5, 6, 7%. But that's relative, right? Because I discovered that about the grocery industry, where I couldn't believe the Krogers here, King Supers, etc., are also very low single digits, but the volume is crazy. So the profits, if you just look at how much profit at the end of the year, is still very meaningful.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true with third party management
Yeah, I want that's
because
exactly where I was gonna go too. Because when I think a lot of folks, they hear of like, well, Google operates at 80% margin or something, and so that becomes where they're thinking like, "Oh, you should get these massive
like tech
margins."
margins, yeah,
But just last week, I was looking up what is the average company margin, and it was between 4 and like 9%, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's like the average company margin
profit
is
margin. You're saying,
profit
yeah,
margin. Net profit margin is low. And then I just double checked, Walmart's is 2.3%.
yeah,
It's like, but at volume, right? So would you
exactly,
rather have be on the 9% end of that spectrum but not have the volume, or the 2.3% be Walmart?
totally. And
Uh,
what does it take to get volume in this industry? So that's the other thing I don't know is if you have just 10 assets and you're doing 5%, what does that
yeah,
add up to typically for like a class A suite of
right,
assets versus in order to get volume in this industry, you need to be at 40 or 50
right.
assets.
Yeah, I mean that is a difference because I wonder how lumpy it is, and also like what you wouldn't want, for example, is like sure off each property at the end of the day the management company makes 10K, because then if you make like one mistake, like you wipe out the 10K, and so
Hmm.
it's like then it's more almost like a surgeon or something where you have to be there can be no mistakes because it is so thin, but we have to do whatever 100 surgeries to
Hmm.
matter,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So I mean, the margin on surgery is not the same, but you get my point where it's like you can't make an error. Walmart obviously has now hit such a scale that 2.3% doesn't equal crazy lumpy revenue either, and they can still make a couple mistakes and it's fine. So
Hmm.
I do wonder. You and I had been told that early on that it was like sort of like once you get to 50 people, then the next mark of efficiency is 150 people. And so I wonder what that kind of band is like for properties where it's like, hey, under 10,
Totally.
then 25, then it's 150 or something, because that would yeah, then it does get tough to be, a GoldOller that's now trying to come out and say, "Great, we want to go from 44 assets to 150," because that's a big chasm, particularly when we've talked about ownership is there aren't that many huge ownership groups. And so you really are sort of like it's a knife fight one by one.
Totally. Yeah. Reminds us of our beginnings.
Hmm.
We knew it wasn't a few properties weren't going to do it. Like,
Yeah.
to have a sustainable business. I am taking this little thread right here. I know who I'm going to call and
Okay.
get on the podcast because we need somebody that I think may be a little removed now from the industry, but was a
Mm.
lifer
Hmm.
that would be comfortable really shedding some light on this.
Yeah,
So
totally. Because even the folks that I've asked that I think would know their stuff, they seem cagey
it
even when I ask
that
them,
was my word.
I don't want.
That is exactly what I was
Yeah.
thinking. Is cagey.
Yeah.
They get pretty cagey about it, and I understand. I understand why, but it's
Should
also like,
be.
come on,
Yeah.
like enough people must know this. Like, you're
Yeah.
not. This isn't Watergate. Like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what else, coming back to Maddie, did I guess stood out or you thought was interesting? Um, she talked a lot about innovation and some specific kind of technology and use cases as far as how they've consolidated, tried to use technology, and then her approach to kind of validating or proving out some of those theories, I guess. Um, and I didn't know if there were pockets in there that really had you leaning in.
I mean, I liked just some of her approach where she was like, hey, every company is going to be unique and different, and you're going to need to figure out what their goals are, that particular management company's goals are, and work within those confines. But she must be the fifth or sixth person that we've had on that's talked about moving everything off the ILS. And then, but also, I think most of them have said after they move off apartments.com that they start throttling back up a little bit in some areas. So it just seems like at this point we have enough anecdotal evidence to say if that's what, just be prepared for that. If you get off the ILS, you will throttle up in some areas. It doesn't mean go all the way back to where you were. As she said, they still spend way less. And I like some of her like broad stroke approach where she's picking, one vendor or one stack. She hasn't been there long enough for us to then start poking her and say like, okay, great. When do you start testing even other vendors off your stack?
Mhm,
Because
mhm.
we've heard from many folks that they don't like to feel pot committed, but she's still in the early innings of her tenure there. So yeah, I didn't quite see the need to go there yet.
Yeah, totally.
Um, Final thing, I guess I just thought it was interesting how much success she'd had with Meet Elise as her AI bot. It seemed like she got a lot of resistance at first, and then it
Yeah,
shook out well.
and we didn't have a chance really to dive into. I guess are they excited, expecting to use Elise AI for what we know it's now intended to be, which is a full, right, comprehensive bot versus just on the front end of like leasing. Because that was super inspiring. It was also almost overwhelming when we had Rebs, Rebecca, talking to us about that. But it's like, how are these bots distinguishing themselves? And Elise seems, maybe the boldest, is like, we are going to build a fully comprehensive bot, from onboarding to offboarding and everything in between. And I would be curious, just to know if A, they're in the know, and B, like if they're already experimenting with it beyond just the kind of front end of it.
Cool.
Be fascinating.
Well, hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Maddie. It was fun and wide ranging, and we appreciate her coming on.